So my name is Emma Williams, and I know many, but not all of y'all here. I am the children's pastor at Grace Chapel, and if you are wondering why I am starting off our Race Talk series, it is because in my other job, with my other hat, I work for the North Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church, so all the Methodist churches in the Dallas area, and part of my job is to work with our Committee on Religion and Race. And so I have worked with those people and worked with our denominational organization that addresses issues of race and how they relate to our faith. And so I've been doing this for the past few years, and it's something that I like to continue to work on. The slideshow that we'll share is actually partially the work of Adam Young, who is a pastor at the Colony, and April Johnson, who's at First Richardson. And so I want to credit their work because they've been doing this for years and years and years. So we're using some of their stuff and some stuff just for Grace Chapel. And I guess before we jump in, I just want to say, like Alex said, we'll have some time for discussion, and I want to encourage y'all to do that. I don't know if you've ever talked into the void that is Zoom for 45 minutes, but there's not a lot of energy in it. So I hope that when we have time to sort of share our experiences, we will feel brave enough to do that. I know the point of this is not to come away feeling uncomfortable or feeling bad about yourself, but we might, because this is a really complicated issue, and most of us will just go ahead and name it our white. And so we are in this whole system of race and racism in a really specific way that is uncomfortable, because we all think of ourselves as good people. So it's not that you're not a good person. We're just all trying to figure this out, and we all have stuff to work through. So I think let's get going. So Alex is going to start sharing this presentation. All right. Okay, so we're starting this off with this idea that we're not colorblind, and that is kind of an old-fashioned, maybe not even old-fashioned. That's kind of what I was brought up on. So in school, like, it doesn't matter what, we're all the same. We, like, there's a melting pot. We're all we're colorblind. I don't see color. That kind of thing used to be sort of the thing to say to show that you are not racist. And as white people, obviously people of color have been way ahead of us on this conversation, but as white people, that's been a way to make us feel better about ourselves, to say we just don't see race. And so what we're talking about today is that we're not colorblind. We can say that race doesn't matter, but even if you feel truly that it does not matter to you, it matters in our society. It matters in the way that we've set up basically our entire cultural system. And so to say that you don't see race is not a helpful dialogue. So that's where we're starting. We're not colorblind, and that's okay. And that's actually a good thing. And so I wanted to start with this story that I heard on NPR in the days when I used to have a commute where I had time to myself and I could do things that I wanted to do that weren't like Octonauts and Super Wings. And so I was listening to NPR on my commute, and there was this story called Why Isn't the Sky Blue? And it is a really long history, but not a long story, about how languages developed the words for color. And it starts with this man who was obsessed with Homer, and he was a 19th century English guy. He'd been the prime minister 4 times, and that's the only personal details I remember about him. And he went through the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he cataloged all of the times that a color was mentioned, and he saw that the colors black and white were mentioned like hundreds of times. Then red, yellow, and green were mentioned like 10 times maybe. And then it would be really odd. Like Homer would say that like sheep were a violet color, or the sea was a wine red color. And so there's this sort of weird it just didn't match up to what we understand. So there are those colors. And then he didn't mention the color blue at all, 0 times in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I don't know if y'all had to read those in high school, or if, like me, you were supposed to read it and have no memory of doing it, so you're not sure if you actually did or not. Those are not short. So in these huge epic poems, no mention of the color blue at all. And then someone came years later, like a century later, and studied not only ancient Greek texts, but ancient Icelandic, Chinese, Vedic hymns, so hymns from the Indian subcontinent, and the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. None of them had any mention of the color blue. And so they started thinking about the way that languages acquire color words. We don't think about that now because we just have color words. Our language has developed. Well, now we have emojis, but before, so we're still developing, but there's a certain order that all languages acquire color words. And it starts with black and white, and then it's red, yellow, green, and those can be switched around, but it's always red, yellow, green, and then blue is always last. Red is always first, like the color of clay, the color of blood. It's easy to reproduce. Blue is very rare in nature. So there aren't like a lot of natural blue flowers and plants and that kind of thing. And so even later, somebody has discovered his work again and took this work to a tribe in Namibia. And it was a tribe that did not have a word for blue. So their language was still sort of in this stage where they did not have a word for blue. And they showed him these 12 squares. And they were all green, and they were green like we would think green was. And there was one except for one, and that one was blue. And it was not so close to green that you couldn't really tell. It was blue. I mean, so close to, yeah. So they were green, all of them were green except for one is blue. And the people in the tribe stared at the squares, and they were asked, which one is different? And they looked and looked, and they couldn't find one that was different. They just didn't see it. And so the people's eyes weren't different. They weren't physiologically different from us. They had the same rods and the same cones, but they couldn't see the difference. And this person said that they hadn't given blue a category, and so they couldn't notice it. They just didn't, it looked the same as everything else. What they said was blue didn't matter to them. Blue didn't matter. It's not that they couldn't see it. It's not that it didn't exist. It just didn't matter to them. And that made me think about sort of our dive today into these categories of race and racism and what it means to say that you're colorblind. When we give something a category, we'll notice it. When we say something is blue, we notice all the things that are blue. But if you don't have a word for it, you don't notice it. So when we say that something is racist, something is a microaggression, when we say that the system is set up in a way that's unfair, we'll notice it. But until we start doing the really hard work of naming those things and saying, this system is unfair, this is what racism is, my family do things that are politically correct, until we can start deciding what those things are, naming them, and taking that seriously, we won't notice them. And so they just pass on. And like our brothers and sisters that are not white have been saying now for a long time, this stuff has happened forever. People of color have been treated unfairly for a long time. Obviously, in the United States, this is how we were set up, but we didn't have a name for it. We didn't have it in our vocabulary. We didn't notice it. We didn't give it a category. So that's what we're doing today. We're doing the hard work of noticing the difference. And you saw those squares, right? One was obviously blue, and that's where we are, right? Like, there's obviously something going on in our country that has been for a long time. We just weren't noticing it. And so I am so thankful that y'all are showing up to do this work today, so that we can notice that blue square, that we can name it, and start sort of changing our lives around that. So as some people might say, right, you've probably heard, well, why do we have to talk about this in the church? I don't go to the church. I don't go to church to talk about politics. I don't go to church to, I want to feel good at church. I don't want to go to church to talk about all this stuff. Can't we just talk about Jesus? Well, yeah, we can talk about Jesus. But the thing is that as Christians, we are called to do this work. And what you see on the screen right now, it might look familiar. These are our United Methodist baptismal vows. And I'm going to read them out loud. We say if you were baptized as a baby, your parents accepted these for you. If you were baptized as a teenager or an adult, you accepted them. Every time we baptize somebody in church, our congregation says, we renew these vows. So I want to read them to you because I think they're really powerful. And once again, these are what our denomination, the largest mainline Protestant denomination in the world. Yeah, in the world. These are our baptismal vows. These are what we agree to. Do you renounce the spiritual forces of wickedness, reject the evil powers of this world, and repent of your sins? Do you accept the freedom and power God gives you to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever form they present themselves? Do you confess Jesus Christ as your Savior, put your whole trust in his grace, and promise to serve him as your Lord in union with the church, which Christ has opened to people of all ages, nations, and races? And this is straight from the Bible. This is Jesus who came to free the oppressed. And so as Christians, we are called by God to be doing this work, to renounce the forces of wickedness, the evil powers of the world, and to resist evil, injustice, and oppression. So it's a big job, but it's something when people say, well, why do we have to talk about this in church? Why do we have to get political? These are people who are being harmed, people who are being killed. And this is the evil, injustice, and oppression that as Christians we're called to resist visibly and vocally. You can go to the next slide. So the first question that we have today is, how were you raised? And basically what this means is when is the moment that you remember in your life that you became aware of race, whether it is a positive or a negative experience? And so think about, I'll give you a few minutes to think about that, and I'll talk a little bit about an experience that I remember. But think about when did it take place? Was it your earliest memory? Was it sometime in adolescence? Was it into adulthood? And how did it influence your life and your worldview? And so for me, that question took me back to like an elementary school age, because I didn't go to a neighborhood school. I went to a magnet school. So diversity was kind of the way that they filled that school. That was one of the platforms of how they were enrolling students. And so I went to school at a pretty diverse elementary school, but there was still divides between friend groups, even as like 5-year-olds. And you could see it because I remember having very good friends who were Black, but for some reason I have no memory of like going to their birthday parties, and I didn't go spend the night with those friends. So I could tell from an early age something was different, right? Because my freedom to go and socialize was different. I wasn't socializing the same way with my Black friends as with my white friends. And that started as you got older in elementary school, the social divides really changed. And so for me, that's kind of when I recognized that there's something different. And that's still not even about my own race, because we don't have that experience as white people in the same way, for the most part, unless your parents sort of actively seek that out. That's about just noticing that people have different races. So I didn't know if anybody wanted to share. If anyone remembers a time when they realized race existed or they had a race.
I'll talk. Mine was actually kind of in the same time frame probably as yours, Emma. I was in second grade, so I was in Lubbock, Texas for like kindergarten through the first half of third grade. And in second grade, I was part of some sort of, I don't know if it was an attempt at like a integration type thing, or really the fine details of it, but I was picked in about a group of about 10 to 15 students from my elementary school in my district, and we were bused across town to Posey Elementary, which was on the, in the predominantly Black area of Lubbock. And so I was one of about 15 kids in a school, a Black school, and it was my parents were upset about it for a while. I didn't really understand a lot of why or what was going on, but it did become pretty obvious once school started. I was like, wow, this isn't anything like my elementary school, where like there were 5 or 10 or 15, 2 or 3 Black kids in your class, and then everybody else was white. And then now it was almost exactly the opposite. And I remember being weirded out by it, like the way people were reacting about it, and it was different. But it was looking back on it, it was like, okay, so what was the purpose of this? What were we trying to accomplish? So
Thanks for sharing.
Mine was a little less obvious. I lived in Chicago. I was about 5 years old, 6 years old. And our neighborhood was on one side of the Dan Ryan Expressway plan. And that was kind of always been the borderline where the Black people stayed on the other side of the Dan Ryan, and the white people were on this side. And they decided they wanted that neighborhood. And it got very ugly. They would buy, the Black people would buy a house on the block and just make it hard for everybody else on that block until they started selling their houses. And it was just a very scary time. And I think I was taught fear at that point in life, and I don't think I've ever gotten over it. So it's been hard.
Thanks for sharing, Nancy. That's really vulnerable. And building highways through neighborhoods has historically been a way that communities have sort of cut through pre-existing communities of color as well. All right, maybe if one more person wants to share, and then we'll keep moving. Or not, if no one feels a burning desire, that's okay too.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Susie? So I'm cooking and running around, so sorry if you can't see me. But so unfortunately, I was raised, both my parents were very racist when I was little. So I remember being about 5. And I was in kindergarten, and I had a little Black friend. Still remember his name was Virgil. But also, I was raised in South Dallas. And so 90% of my school was Black children. And so this little Black boy called me one day to see if I wanted to come out and play. And I remember getting off of the phone and my dad being very stern with me and telling me, we're not friends with them. We don't do that. He is not allowed to call here anymore. And I remember being so confused, because I was like, but most of my friends are a different color. And I was just like 5 and so confused. And so it's been a battle with my parents like my whole life, but they've gotten better about having the conversation, and my dad's gotten better, a lot better, honestly. But it's just one of those things where it was like the most confusing thing, and I had no idea why I was being told I couldn't be friends with somebody. So just so young and so naive that it was a thing.
Thanks. Thank you, Susie. Yeah, and I think there's probably everyone has had some sort of experience where they recognize that race exists, because that's just sort of the communities and cultures that we are in right now. So we make a big out race, and yet I think I heard Susie say and Chris say, it's confusing to young people, and we're not exactly sure what's going on. And so this next video is a short video, and it's going to say in the middle of it, like, we're going to stop and play a game, but we're not going to do that because we're on Zoom. And so I just want you it's going to say, we're going to stop and play a game, and I just want you to think about what they're saying, and it'll move forward. Mm-mm. Did you need to unmute your computer?
No, hold on.
I think your whole computer is muted. There you go.
Co-author of the new book, Happy Money, The Science of Smarter Spending. I want to talk to you today about a piece that we have in the July-August issue of Harvard Business Review. But before I tell you what's in that piece, I first want to ask you to play a game with me. You're looking at an array of faces right now, and I'm going to ask you to play a version of the game that you may have played as a little kid that was called Guess Who. And if you remember that game, you and a partner both had faces in front of you. One of you had a face, and the other person had to guess the face you were looking at from that array of faces. I want you to play this game with me right now. Grab a partner and pick a face that your partner is going to have to guess. And the only rule is your partner can only ask you questions that you can answer with the words yes or no. Pause this video and take a few minutes to play the game. When you're done playing the game, come back, hit unpause, and I'll tell you more about the research that we've conducted. I'm Michael Norton. I'm an associate professor at Harvard Business School.
So I want you to think about how you would describe the person that you chose. So just look at these, pretend like you've just chosen somebody, and just think in your head, what are the descriptions that I would use? Okay, we'll just keep going.
So you finished the game. How did it go? What kinds of questions did your partner ask you? Maybe they asked, is this person smiling or not? Or is this person wearing a hat or not? Or maybe they asked a question like, is this person black or not? But if they did, that would be quite unusual, because in the research that we've done, we find people are very, very reluctant to ask about race when we have them play the exact game that you just played. Why are people reluctant? It appears as though they feel that by asking about race, it might signal that they care a lot about race, and it might even signal that they might be a racist. We find in our experiments that even though the array was half white and half black, and asking the question, is the person white or black, a very useful tool for narrowing down the faces, people are really, really reluctant to ask about that question. And in fact, in another version of the game, we find that if we have people play with a black partner, they become even more unlikely to ask about race, because they're even more worried that they might appear to be biased when they do that. And there's an even worse outcome, because people who avoid asking about race, even though they are trying to do so to look as though they don't care about race, end up looking more uncomfortable and more biased. I think the dynamics in this game, which you and your partner just experienced, really suggest how complicated and interesting the dynamics are when we talk about race in contemporary America. We also tried some different versions of this game. In one of them, we actually asked not grown-ups to play the game, but for children to play what is, in the end, a children's game. We wondered when we had them play the game you just played whether the same thing might happen. What we found is that older children, by the time they were 9 or 10, actually stopped asking about race in the game. They'd already learned that maybe it's not wise to ask about race. But the kids who were younger, who were 7 and 8, who weren't so concerned about those social norms yet, in fact, were more likely to ask about race. And as a result, they ended up beating the older kids, performing better on the game. We tried one other version of the game. We ran a version of the game that's very much like the one you played again, but with one difference. In this case, all of the faces were white, but each picture had, in the lower corner of the picture, a white or a black dot. And we wanted to see if it's not about race, if it's not about is this person white or black, but more is this dot white or black, if now people would be very willing to use color because it could be so useful for guessing the face. And that is exactly what we see as well. So if it's race, people will not ask the question black or white, but if it's the color of a dot, like the color of paint on a wall, people are perfectly happy to ask about white or black. And it really suggests that it's the social dynamics surrounding race that make us so uncomfortable talking about color. We know in everyday life, people often struggle to describe someone in the workplace who may be of a different ethnicity. And while the motivation comes from a good place, which is, I don't want to be or appear racist, it ends up impeding communication. And organizations that are savvy realize that a good solution to race is not to avoid talking about race, which, as you saw when you played the game, can impede communication between people, but actually acknowledge race openly. One of the things that we see when we talk to companies that are forward-looking in this space is they're being open and honest about racial differences between workers and among workers. Thanks for taking time to play our game. You can learn more about this research in the piece that Evan Applebaum and I wrote, which will appear in the July.
So as you can see, and if we would have played it, I've done this with several groups, and that research pretty much bears out in everyone. People feel like they shouldn't mention race. They feel like they should pretend like it doesn't exist. That actually makes sorry, Simon is yelling, I'm going to be honest. But that actually makes it harder to relate to people. And it also means that you're not able to understand the full experience of someone. And if you pretend like everyone has the same experience of you. And so that's what this idea about this iceberg concept of culture, right? So there's the stuff that we can see, and that's how we evaluate someone's culture. But there's all of this stuff that's underlying, that's under the surface. That if we pretend like race doesn't exist, if we pretend like everyone's the same, that we don't notice that people are different, we miss all of these underlying unspoken things that can help us relate to other people and help us understand where they're coming from, and ultimately help us deepen our relationships with others. Let's see. Now I'm doing slides. Excuse me. Yeah. All right, so we're going to go through a couple definitions just so we can all be on the same page. And so our first definition, it's a little quiz because school's out and we just want to keep everybody sharp. So the first one is knowledge or understanding of how a person from a particular country, race, religion, etc., lives and behaves. This helps us function effectively across a variety of cultural contexts. So why don't y'all open that chat feature and everybody put in the letter that you think this one is. I'm going to give you 10 seconds so that we keep moving, because it really doesn't matter if you get it right or not. And please don't feel pressure. 8, 9, 10. That's how I count when we're on calls with kids as well. Okay, great job, everybody. Yes, so this is cultural intelligence. So this is what we are striving for, and it's sometimes can be misconstrued, right? As like we're thinking if we care about other people's race, then we are feeling biased, right? But we're not. What we're trying to do is understand people's culture. And then the other definitions of those, just so we can get all of these out of the way. Bias is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. Inclusion, proactively seeking out and involving someone in a group, and diversity, many different types of people, a range of different people. All right, we'll do another one. I'm gonna hit these quick. So here's the next one. The everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely on their marginalized group membership. What does everyone think? Yeah, good job. It's microaggressions. And this is something that kind of gets tossed around, especially by people that feel that racism is not an important part of our society. Is they'll say like, oh, microaggressions, it's like no one wants to get their feelings hurt. And so we, my friends who put a lot of this together found this pretty funny video that I want to play real quick. And basically we'll explain better what microaggressions are.
So you're not good at golf, but you're white.
People of color have to deal with racial microaggressions every single day. So microaggressions are those little unintentional insults that basically see people of color as stereotypes, which got me thinking, what if white people had to deal with racial microaggressions?
So, like, where are you from? No, like, where are you really from?
Why do you have an accent? Like a Swedish accent.
You know, your English is really, really good. It's like I can't even tell you have an accent or anything.
I don't have an accent.
No, that's what I'm saying. You don't speak Gaelic?
You don't speak German?
Can you say a curse word in European?
You know, like, what does that even mean?
Hey, Connor, you know about NASCAR stuff, right? Can you take a look at this?
Can you teach me how to line dance?
Play the banjo.
Act entitled in the supermarket. I love white food. No real flavor to it. Never an upset tummy.
You're so exotic.
How do you get your hair like that? I love how it's so limp.
Ew, why does it feel like that? Oh my God, so it just does that?
No, you are really pretty for a white girl.
Your eyes are so round, like this.
You know who you look like? Kenny Chesney.
Zach Braff.
Emma Stone.
Rachel Maddow. My friend Chad. Maybe you know him, because he's white too.
No, Emma Watson.
Not Macklemore. What's the other guy?
No, is it Emma Thompson?
It's C-H-A-D, like Chad.
One of the Emmas. You look like an Emma.
You know who you look like? I bet you hear this all the time. Jeffrey Dahmer.
How does it feel to be the token white guy in the office?
Hey, Connor, can we get a white perspective on this?
I love everything about white culture. You guys are like so fun.
What do you mean you don't listen to Creed? You're white.
You've never tried meth. But you're white.
You don't act like a normal white person.
You're not really white, though.
You're not really white.
I'm whiter than you are.
So, did all your ancestors own slaves?
No, but of course he wishes that he could still own slaves. That's a part of his culture.
Bryce, back me up on this one. The thing you have to understand about white culture
I
is
went
that
to
white
an
people are...
historically white college, so
okay,
I know
but
about
I
white culture.
backpacked in Europe.
So can you see how ridiculous this was? I know. Story of my life. If you've ever experienced microaggressions because of your race, gender, sexuality, or body type, go ahead and vent about it in the comments. Can you teach me?
So you're...
Okay, it's just kind of funny, but I hope that helps everybody understand what microaggressions are. And like she mentioned, you know, microaggressions are like these little naggy things that one of them is not a big deal, but when you're dealing with it constantly, it becomes just like another burden that you have to deal with. And these can be from any sort of, or can happen to any sort of marginalized group. So you might maybe you have are in a group that has experienced sort of the same thing over and over and over again. So those are microaggressions, and they are differentiated from discrimination, which is the treatment of a person or a particular group of people differently in a way that is worse than people are usually treated. Prejudice, which is an unfair and unreasonable opinion or feeling formed without enough thought or information. And explicit bias, which is different from just regular bias in that it refers to attitudes or beliefs we have about a person or a group on a conscious level. So it's not sort of an implicit or unconscious bias. Most of the time, these biases and their expressions arise as a direct result of a perceived threat. All right, so the next definition, and I think the last, yeah, you're welcome. The last definition, the end of our quiz for today, prejudice plus power. What do we think prejudice plus power is? Hit me up in the comment box. Yeah, this is good. This is, everybody gets to feel okay because they can see each other's answers. This is good. I like that kind of thing. That's like when you play a game, but you don't have to keep score, which is my favorite and Alex's least favorite. Yeah, so that's what racism is. And this is an important sort of distinction because this is where you'll hear people say, you know, something like they'll refer to reverse racism, or say, well, Black people can be racist too, or a different, you know, some non-white group. Well, those people are racist as well. Anyone can hold a prejudice. So like I said before, like a prejudice, where did my definitions go, just so I don't mess it up? An unfair or unreasonable opinion or feeling formed without enough thought or knowledge. Anybody can do that. We all can be prejudiced. But racism is a specific term that's talking about prejudice, these unfair and unreasonable opinions that are empowered by people, or that are put into place by people in power, by systems. So when you are in a group that is not in the majority, you don't have that power, so you can't do this prejudice plus power, which is racism. And so once again, it's not that people that are people of color can hold prejudice. Everyone can and does hold prejudices, but there's not a power in the equation. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about racism. So I mentioned implicit bias, which is the unconscious bias, basically, that everyone has, that we have to really dig into and try to work out. Privilege, I know that's another hot button definition, or hot button word, because because it makes people feel like they didn't work hard. And that's not what privilege is at all. We won't get into sort of this idea of white privilege tonight very much, because that is a much longer conversation. But the idea of privilege is special advantage or authority possessed by a particular person or group. And what this doesn't say is that they didn't really earn. And so when we talk about privilege, it's a hurdle that you don't have to jump. It's a burden that you don't have to bear. So it's not that you didn't earn something, but it's just something that's not holding you back, right? So when you talk about white privilege, it means that your race is not something that's holding you back. You're not getting a second look on a loan because you are Black or Latino. You're not. So it's this idea that that whatever your privilege is, and this exists obviously, like male privilege, people of higher incomes, younger people have privilege over older people. So privilege doesn't just exist for white people. Straight people have privilege over LGBTQ. And so it's just something that is not a hurdle for you. That's what we're talking about when we talk about privilege. And then stereotype, which once again, everyone holds stereotypes. It's when you have an idea that you use to describe a particular type of person, or a person thought to represent such an idea, a set idea that people have about what something is like, especially when that idea is wrong. And stereotypes aren't always bad. So we think about like a stereotype that like maybe you would say like Asian people are really good at math. Well, that's a stereotype, and that's something that we need to break down. And people would say, oh, but it's not bad, right? It's not, but it's still a stereotype, and we need to work on seeing the full person. We need to work on seeing the full person, the person that God has created, not a stereotype of what we think those people are just because of what they look like. So this has been floating around the internet, and since we all live on the internet right now, I'm sure many of you have seen it. So I just wanted to throw this out here, and we won't spend a lot of time, but I think when we're talking about racism and privilege and all these things that kind of lie under the surface, that this is a good image to see. I found it on Nadia Boltz-Weber's Facebook page, and I think that's where it's mainly been shared from. I don't know if she created the image. But these things on the top are the things that are socially unacceptable, and the things on the bottom are things that we can potentially be implicit in. I think this is Sarah asking, what is spiritual bypassing? And I'm not exactly sure what she's talking about on here, but I would think that they mean using spirituality, using your religion to not have to address Christianity. Like, why can't we just talk about Jesus? But I could be wrong. So feel free to fact check me on that if anybody knows. And so I just circled a few that are hard for, because there are a lot under here that are hard. So I circled a few that we either deal with constantly or that are hard for me in particular. So not challenging racist jokes. We all go to work and we all have family and friends, and sometimes they say things that are off color, is how I think polite people would say it, but sometimes they will say racist jokes. So not challenging racist jokes. There's another one. This is Black, Indigenous, People of Color. That's that acronym as Halloween costumes. We do this every single year. We talk about how culture is not a costume, and yet every single year we see people dressing up as nationalities. And then this one, which is really hard because this is such a sticky situation, education funding from property taxes. Because of the way that our neighborhoods are segregated and because of the way that wealth lies in white communities versus communities of color, these funding education through property taxes kind of sets up a system to where schools in neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color are underfunded. And so, man, there's not an easy answer to that at all. But that's something that we probably all deal with and are all sort of implicated in. Courtney has an answer for us. Spiritual bypassing is a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. Oh, Courtney says it's what I said, so I'm going to say that Courtney's right. So this is floating around. I encourage you to find this on Not Able Flipper's Facebook and look at these underlying things and find the ones that really get under your skin and see what you can do to sort of investigate that. Because that's the place where growth is going to happen. So let's see. And so part of the way we can move into sort of this cultural intelligence, part of the way we can move out of living into these socially acceptable ways of being implicit in a system that is unfair and racist is taking in different sort of media. And I have put here just like some stuff that I am aware of, and it is by no means exhaustive, and it might not even be your cup of tea, but there's so much out there that there's a place to start. So a lot of us, when we watch movies, when we listen to podcasts, when we read books, we're watching things that are written from a white perspective. They're written by white people for white people, and we don't blink because they look like us. And so one sort of very easy way to start thinking about cultural intelligence and to start sort of integrating that into your life, to seeing like the fullness of all people and not living in stereotypes, is to expand what you're taking in. And so some of these are really sort of serious. The New Jim Crow is about mass incarceration. White Fragility is a great book that's been discussed in our Grace Chapel comments a lot. So it's a good thing to read, or even the author does a 18-minute TED talk that you can watch and pretty much get the gist as well. So some of the, and the 1619 Project is the New York Times articles, and they have a podcast too, basically about like the history of slavery. Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack is a article about what it means to have privilege, and it's just like a really, 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 really long checklist of things that you were like, oh, I didn't even realize that was privilege. Things like, does your doctor believe you when you say something hurts? That kind of stuff. So it's a good thing to get into. Code Switch is a good podcast, just all in all. The Hate U Give is a book and a movie, possibly on Netflix, possibly on Hulu, something like that. It's streaming somewhere. Black Coffee with White Friends is an Instagram account, and they have a website as well. It's just like a Black woman who is very kindly helping us out, and she doesn't have to, and she's doing it anyway. The Conscious Kid has resources for kids, books, ways to talk to kids, things that have to do with kids, to keep to raise children who are culturally intelligent and who are aware of what's going on. And then I also included in here Blackish and One Day at a Time, which are two sitcoms that I like. I actually like the whole Kenya Burris is the guy who created Blackish, and he also has Mixedish, which is about like a family of a white dad and a black mom who have kids in the late 80s. And they're like, it's a sitcom, but they also talk about serious stuff. And also, like, it's good to remember that everyone has a full life, and it's not always like facing down oppression. Like, everyone has a life that is nuanced and has joy and sorrow and that kind of thing. And so even searching out sort of light content that's created by non-white people is a good way to just keep yourself expanding sort of your understanding of the world. Yes. Yeah, I also watch Fresh Off the Boat. Basically any family comedy that's on ABC, I probably watch that. That's what I have the energy for at the end of the day. But yeah, so finding, it doesn't have to always be the heaviest, most sort of implicating thing, because sometimes we just, once again, need to understand that like there is a lot of joy that exists as well. And once again, people are full people. So that's a good way to start. Oh, good. This is timing out well. Okay, so this sort of last part that I want to talk about is I follow these daily devotionals by Richard Rohr, and he's a Franciscan brother in New Mexico, and he's also like a big Enneagram guy, and I really like him. And he said they send out from the Center for Action and Contemplation, they send out a short devotion every morning, and when I'm up feeding Simon at 4 a.m. I read it, so it's a little quiet time for me. And right now they're talking about these 5 conversions, and it's from the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So it's Richard Rohr's reading of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But this is talking about how do we move to be in solidarity with people that are oppressed, and especially from a faith perspective. How do we do that? And it's sort of in these 5 stages. And as we go through them, I want to remind you that these you or someone you love is maybe on this spectrum. And maybe you were somewhere and then you've gone back and you want to move forward. So this isn't like we're all trying to sort of move forward, as John Wesley would say, we're all trying to move forward to perfection. So it's not a place of judgment, but it's a place of recognizing where you are and where we can continue going. All right, so let's get started. So the first one is this basic compassion and empathy for people who are powerful. And he says that our hearts have to be softened. And that feels it says basic, right? But even in the United States, many Christians are not here. They don't have this basic empathy because we are trained to blame people that are poor, that are immigrants, that are refugees, LGBTQ people. We're trained to blame them for their troubles because they think if those people, stereotypes and our prejudice taking place, would simply work harder and they would do things the right way, if they would change their minds, if they would not be so loud, if they would stay hidden, if they would pray a little bit harder, that everybody would be better off. So this first step of basic compassion moves past blaming people that are oppressed, and it's the place where we have to begin, and it's a place where where many people need to be moved to, not just from. So the second conversion is this anger at an unjust situation that caused this sort of poverty, disenfranchisement, oppression. And this happens when, usually when somebody that you have made a relationship with somebody that is oppressed, right? So you've made a relationship with a person of color or an LGBTQ person, a person with a different background. So your sister is marrying a Black person, or your coworker is LGBTQ, or you know someone whose cousin is immigrating, that sort of thing. So you've made a personal relationship, and so when you see something that is unfair that happens to them, instead of staying at a safe distance, you feel their pain. And so there's an anger that comes out of that. But he says the best criticism for us, for people that have social power, is not criticizing the bad, but practicing the better. And so that's kind of where we move to. And it's also important to note, because a lot of times people will try to cut the legs out of people that are being oppressed, because they'll cut the legs out from under them by saying, like, you shouldn't be angry, and being angry is destructive. You should have love in your heart. And he says, for oppressed communities, anger can be a form of survival, and it's necessary on the path toward healing. So we're experiencing anger in a different way. So but what we can do is listen to anger with compassion. That can be sort of a form of solidarity. All right. The third conversion. This is when we idealize some of the virtues of disempowered, disenfranchised people that we don't have ourselves. And we'll see this especially with like youth that go on a mission trip, or people that are, maybe have never gone to like be in community with people that are not like them before, and they see that they live differently, and they see some of these idealized characteristics. And so while it's not bad to look at that sort of thing, it places this unfair burden on people, because it means that we help them because of how good they are, right? We help them because they're like saintly people. But when you project only these good qualities onto people, it eases the burden of solidarity for us. So it means that we're not helping them because people deserve this, because we are all God's children. We're helping them because of how good they are. But people deserve that their full humanity is celebrated. Which brings us to the fourth conversion. So this is this deepening recognition of the impact of systemic oppression. Seeing the way, and so this can be when you recognize internalized oppression. So this is when you move past idealizing people, which is another stereotype, right? Which you're putting a stereotype onto people, and you're seeing the way that people are socialized to fail. And you see, we see this right now with the riots in Minneapolis, because people are saying, well, what they shouldn't be rioting. How dare they, right? And so we see, but we don't investigate the way that people are socialized. When I was little, my mom wouldn't let us say that we hated anybody, especially people in our family, because she said that when you say it, it becomes true. And you'll hear this in like educational pedagogy too, right? You don't tell kids they're bad. You don't tell kids they're dumb, because then they live into that. And so when we set up our society in a way that tells people that they are not worth as much, then we see that actions out of that actions out of those messages are disappointing, and can be scary, and make you kind of wonder what's going on. But that's because we didn't get those messages. Me as a white woman didn't get those same sort of messages. So recognizing that this is systemic. It's not something one person fixes for another person. And then the last thing, this fifth conversion, is where we're all hoping to move to. So choosing to walk with people, be taught by them, and to love them as equals. Once again, recognizing the humanity in them, the good, the bad, the full person, and allowing your own perception of what someone else needs to go, and listening to what an oppressed person says. So a lot of times we hear right now, and it's confusing, especially if you're new to this dialogue, we hear like, especially right now, it's Black people, but it's all people of color, like, we don't want to hear white people's thoughts on this, right? And so that's confusing, but this comes out of this need that they haven't been listened to, and we haven't listened, but we're talking first instead. And so this fifth conversion, which is the last one, is allowing your ego to to go. Your idea that you know what will fix it, you know what people need to go and to listen to someone. And this takes rebirth. So it says, those who undergo this fifth conversion must take on a new form of existence. They can no longer remain as they were. And this is a quote from the book that I wanted to read because it was really powerful. So, dialogue cannot exist without humility. How can I dialogue if I regard myself as a case apart from others, mere its in whom I cannot recognize other eyes? How can I dialogue if I consider myself the owner of truth and knowledge? How can I dialogue if I am closed to and even offended by the contributions of others? Self-sufficiency is incompatible with dialogue. At the point of the encounter, there are neither utter ignoramuses nor perfect sages. There are only people who are attempting together to learn more than they know now. And that's what I think we're doing here. And that's what our race talks are going to be about, is that we want to learn more than we know now. And we know that we can't do it alone. Self-sufficiency is incompatible with dialogue. And so I wanted to close because I've been thinking a lot about this story of Nicodemus from John. So I'll read this and then we'll close. There was a Pharisee named Nicodemus, a Jewish leader. He came to Jesus at night and said to him, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, and no one could do these miraculous signs that you do unless God is with him." Jesus answered, "I assure you, unless someone is born anew, it's not possible to see God's kingdom." Nicodemus asked, "How is it possible for an adult to be born? It's impossible to enter the mother's womb for a second time and be born, isn't it?" Jesus answered, "I assure you, unless someone is born of water and the Spirit, it's not possible to enter God's kingdom. Whatever is born of the flesh is flesh, and whatever is born of the Spirit is spirit. Don't be surprised that I said to you, you must be born anew. God's Spirit blows wherever it wishes. You hear its sound, but you don't know where it's coming from or where it's going. It's the same with everyone who is born of the Spirit." And so my prayer is that we will be born again and again and again into sort of into a world that pain exists and oppression exists and people experience the world differently from us, but that we would also be born into a world of hope, into a world that we know that God is acting in, so that we could have the courage to speak out about resisting these evils and impressions and figure out how in the world do I fit into this, because we all have to work individually to make a little bit of difference.